Are you the kind of person that likes to be in the spotlight, or do you like to be behind the scenes? A lot of times, those are the two options. And I would just want to say today, we don't all like the spotlight, but we were made to be seen. I want you to think back with me before life happened. And by that, I mean, we got a little cynical, we got guarded. Before life happened, you probably like to show off a little bit, right? A little bit? Think back with me. Your paintings, your poetry, your inventions, your sport, your skills, whatever they were, your dance, your song. But again, that was before life happened. Look at the person next to you and say, is that true? Did you ever like that? Did you ever have a painting you were proud of? Did you ever jump really high and want to show that off, or your jump roping skills or something like that? Did you ever? Well, yeah. But that was before life happened. Before the squeeze came, before we felt those pressures. But even still, we all like to get like an opportunity to get dressed up a little bit, right? Maybe not under the scrutiny of the red carpet, but dressing up for a date, or senior pictures, or the school dance, or a holiday ball, or a Christmas work party, something besides your Zoom work pajamas, right? You and I want to be seen, to be taken seriously. That's actually just another way to say glory. We want glory. We want to be seen and taken seriously, like our life has some weight to it, that it matters. We want to be understood and enjoyed, to be known and to be loved. But for many of us, life went in another direction. And for some of us, that happened really early on, where your dreams were crushed. Your highest dreams now kind of lay on the carpet. For some of you, that was 2 years old, 3 years old. That was at the separation of parents. That was at that comment on the playground, or that was a conversation from an elder in your community, and it just flattened it out. Your glory, that weightiness, that significance was trampled. You tried your humor, and instead of being laughed with, you were laughed at. Maybe you tried something and failed so miserably, and maybe it was a moral failure, or maybe it wasn't. And you feel like, I'm just kind of wrapped now. Like so many spiders are doing right now in our backyards and down the street. We saw that the other day on our own deck. Spider grabbing one leg and wrapping it up and pinning it to the web, and then another, and then another. And that's the way your life has gone, maybe. Where your big dreams and your big hopes kind of just got slowly destroyed. Maybe it wasn't all at once. Maybe it was just a slow thing. But then we stay wrapped up by the restrictions that are placed on us by other people. When you lose the quest for glory, weightiness, significance, that's good. And we lose that quest for glory, and we call that humility. But really, it's fear. Fear of being known. Fear of having hope. Fear of being so significant that you have to be relied upon. Maybe a fear of being found out. Hiding, though, isn't humility. It's a product of fear and shame. And we've got to go in another direction. We can't stay at the point where we're saying, well, you know what, God can't use me. I'm damaged goods. I can't be loved. People have treated me viciously, and apparently God has just stood by watching. Have you felt that? God, where were you when those things were said to me? Where were you when the damage was done? I've learned that in those moments where the damage was done, that Jesus was there, but that he was weeping. He was there and watching human cruelty. He was there and watching abuse of power. He was there and weeping with us. And I wonder if that's our mode right now. Because if you're asking questions like, how can I be of any worth and significance and value when God appears to overlook me right now? I feel on my own right now with all this stress and trouble I'm going through. You might hear, God works in mysterious ways. And some of you are not enjoying the mystery. Right? Can I get an amen? I'm not enjoying, write it in the chat, or write it in your comment section. I am not enjoying this mystery. Why is this happening to me? Why is this happening to us? God, what could you possibly be doing? And now, we're in a time of global upheaval, a national and personal upheaval. And God appears to be AWOL, absent without leave. But this isn't the first time this has happened. No. Now, 2,500 years ago, let me set the context. It was last month in 480 BC, so 2,500 years ago, Xerxes, the king of Persia, brought his coalition, the coalition that was formed in that 180-day banquet we learned about in Esther chapter 1. He brings this coalition and goes to battle Greece, an attempt to conquer the empire and expand his own empire. Beginnings had started with his predecessors, his father, but as this progressed and he went into this series of battles. And in one battle, 2,500 years ago, last month, in Thermopylae, he was met by King Leonidas. Some of you know this story. It's a famous one. The 300 Spartans. And he meets his match and is turned back. Eventually his conquest overall fails, and he returns home agitated, defeated, despondent. And he starts to think about his former wife, Queen Vashti. Oh, what a beauty she was. And oh, why don't I have her again? Oh yeah, my associates, my aides, the people who were supposed to help me direct my thoughts, they had me kick her out, and he's missing her. But then he gets distracted by this other proposal. And that's where we pick it up in Esther chapter 2. Let me read it with you. After these things, and there's probably a 4-year gap in the middle of this, when the anger of King Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, had abated, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's young men who attended him said, okay, let's distract you. Let's do this. Let beautiful virgins be sought out for the king. And let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in Susa, their capital, under the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the women. Let their cosmetics be given them, and let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This pleased the king, and he did so. Now, there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives, carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. And when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa the citadel in custody of Haggai, Esther was also taken into the king's palace and put in the custody of Haggai, who had charge of the women. And the young woman pleased him and won his favor. And he quickly provided her with cosmetics and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to the best place in the harem. Esther had not made known her people or kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. And every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. Now when the turn came for each young woman to go into King Ahasuerus, After being 12 months under the regulations for the women, since this was the regular period of their beautifying, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with spices and ointments for women. When the young woman went into the king in this way, she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go in, and in the morning she would return to the second harem in the custody of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the concubines. She would not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her, and she was summoned by name. And when the term came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his own daughter to go into the king, she asked for nothing except what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who had charge of the women, advised. Now Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her. And when Esther was taken to the king Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than all the women. And she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great feast for all his officials and servants. It was Esther's feast. He also granted a remission of taxes to the provinces and gave gifts with royal generosity. So that's our text. And this is the difficult situation Esther finds herself in. This is the dark side of the empire. Oh, sweet King Xerxes, just looking for a wife. No. The king has twice now shown that his power is up for grabs by those around him. He is weak in that way. He's holds absolute power, of course, and he's allowed others with their own agendas to decide what he will decree. They get rid of Queen Vashti, and now they're going to manipulate him to kind of soften his heart and to help him with his sexual needs, right? To manipulate. They know how to manipulate him, and now they're using him. That's the picture of Xerxes, Ahasuerus, that we get in this passage. He's not such a great character of lots of intentionality and worthy of respect. He's actually kind of laughable, right? And the girls are brought into Xerxes' harem. They lived under the care of these eunuchs who supervised their care, right? And the eunuchs basically did this. They prepared them for sex with the king, who then used them and disposed of them. Marian Taylor writes this. She calls this the perfected institutionalization of rape, in which the king's will is the only will. And that effectively restored the king's sense of control. Okay, I can always just use women to feel better. I mean, you could probably gloss over the story and just say, oh yeah, it was like a talent show. It was a lovely thing. But after one night in the king's bed, these women, all the women, were returned to the harem of concubines, right? And Karen Jobes talks about this. She says they would spend their life, the rest of their life, in luxurious but desolate seclusion, hidden away. You didn't please the king enough. You're damaged goods now. But cheer up, you have all the pleasures of the kingdom, except for you have to live like a widow, basically. You'd never leave the harem to marry or return to your family. You wouldn't even see the king again unless he asked for you by name. Your children would be conceived by the king in these unions. They were raised to serve the king in positions of authority in the kingdom, but not ever an heir to the throne. That's what you get for one night with the king. And so this isn't a glorious American Idol talent show. This is more like a really disturbed Bachelor, show, or more like the Hollywood casting couch. If you want this role, if you want to not live in desolation, this is what you have to do. So a seriously broken, messed up situation. Where is God? Is he at work? Is he standing by? And of course, in the book of Esther, we see nothing. except for behind the scenes how God might be working. And there's hope here. There's hope here. But allow me to interject with a current situation that's happening. There's a lot of money on the east side, and a lot of people living like the kings of old, and domestic abuse is happening at alarming rates. I'm part of conversations in Issaquah and in Sammamish where wives are almost kept like concubines. They're abused and kept in this power control because the husband is making money, and after all, he makes the decisions, and of course the men aren't faithful to these women, and so there are cycles of abuse and emotional poverty even in areas of wealth. You might have an opportunity to be a listening ear to one of these people. Women of ICC, as you love your neighbor, you may get to be the listening ear. That leads to freedom and healing as you engage people and find out what's really going on in their life and in their story. I want to highlight our two characters right now, Mordecai and Esther, and see what we can take from them. So Mordecai is introduced as a Jew, someone from Judah, and he would be, this is the term Jew described kind of all the Hebrews during that period, anybody from anywhere in Israel, even though that would be from Judah specifically, where the name Jew comes from. His name is actually kind of a Hebrew form of the god of Babylon, Marduk-Mordecai. And we see that Mordecai is now in the citadel in Susa, where the palace is that Xerxes, Ahasuerus, is reigning from. And we see some pretty interesting things. He serves at the gate, which means he's one of the royal officials. So he's working in there. And we know that when the exile took place, his grandfather and their grandfathers were taken from the city, and those people in nobility were trained up, much like Daniel, to rule and reign and be a part of the king's court at that point. And so that's where I think we find Mordecai. But there's an interesting picture. He's said he's basically a king of, or a son of Kish, a Benjaminite, which is the same as Saul. And so we see in his family line where there's going to be a growing sense, especially in chapter 3, that he has got a mortal enemy, just like Saul had a mortal enemy against King Agag, and he was an Amalek, king of Amalek. Agag in 1 Samuel 15, if you want to go look that up, is the center of a long-standing war between those who would be from the line of Agag and those who would be from the line of Saul. And so we'll see that in the next chapter. But Hadassah, or Esther, we see her showing up here in verse 7. She's lost her parents and living with her uncle. We don't know anything about how they were raised as Jews and what their thoughts were going into this. We do know that all the while in those that have left Persia, and those that have left and gone back to Israel and to rebuild the temple, they had a whole nother story going on of purification and let's get right back to the Bible, right? And let's build the temple and let's worship Yahweh and let's throw away idols and let's purify. And here we have Esther, almost all alone in Persia, living her life. Her name is probably taken from one of their goddesses of love and war, Ishtar. And Mordecai named after Marduk. There's a picture of her life is not as pure and golden as we might imagine. Of course, there's no mention of God or what she's doing here. So she's probably saying this red carpet ride cannot be part of your sovereign plan. This being taken from the city and brought to the harem. That God, this can't be part of what you're doing. This is messed up. This is broken. Why in the world, God, would you think this is okay? And I want you to find some echoes there in your own life, a broken, messed up situation that we have. Some of you have some really deep struggles, some very deep wounds in the past, and you're still asking those questions. And I think Hadassah, Esther, if she had read her Bible, and I don't know, we don't really know, she would probably be saying, I shouldn't be here. This is wrong. God, what are you doing? And as we look at this story, which is pretty awful, a young virgin spends 12 months getting makeup and treatments to become the most sexually provocative one who could win over the king's pleasure in a night. Not a great, lovely story. I mean, are we supposed to say, daughters, be like Esther. Use your body to get into the halls of power, right? So we're not really looking to Esther and Mordecai as examples of high character. We don't really have enough to go on to make them glorious heroes. And guess what? That's actually a good thing. Because there's a better story coming on here. I love what Karen Jobes says, and she's a commentator on this, and I want to read it to you. She says, this is where the silence about Esther and Mordecai's character and spiritual fidelity, like we don't know about whether they're being faithful, becomes a powerful encouragement. Regardless of whether they always knew what the right choice was or whether they had the best of motives, God was working through even their imperfect decisions and actions to fulfill his perfect purposes. Is that you? Imperfect decisions and actions? But God is still working to fulfill his perfect purposes. Oh, I hope so. Other than Jesus, even the godliest people, Karen goes on to say, the godliest people of the Bible were flawed, often confused, and sometimes outright disobedient. And we're no different from them. Yet our gracious God omnipotently works his perfect plan through them, through us. And most surprisingly, even through powerful political structures that sometimes operate in evil ways. Yes, on the dark side of the empire, God is at work. Now, he may be upsetting the empire of the United States right now. He might be upsetting these halls of power in churches and in Hollywood and actually finance and big industry and everywhere in the last 10 years has suffered this major shaking, the housing industry, all these different things. God may be upsetting all these things, but he's at work. Do you want to join him in that? But you don't feel like you can? Because you're too flawed? You're too compromised? Well, there's a better word for you. Karen Jobes talks about how we can't use Esther's behavior as a moral role model. She says, how would you use this episode from Esther's life to teach virtue to your teenage daughter? Because that's what Esther would have been, a teenager. As she stands on the threshold of womanhood, what message would she get? Make yourself as attractive as possible to powerful men. Use your body to advance God's kingdom. The ends justify the means. Karen's like, this model of using her as an example just fails, right? Just fails. Esther may well have been a virtuous woman, obedient to God's law. But even if she was, the author chooses to veil her virtue in this morally ambiguous and complex situation. You find yourself in a morally ambiguous and complex situation. She goes on to say, he does not allow us to come to simple answers when we consider Esther's life in light of Scripture. The author is skillfully describing a morally ambiguous and complex situation because that is the way real life often is in this fallen world. Okay, so we can't take them as an example necessarily, but let's go back to the beginning where I talked about our own messed up stories. As I said in the beginning, you and I want to be seen, and that's good. We want to be taken seriously. That's good. That's glorious. We want to be understood and enjoyed, to be known and to be loved, but for many of us, life went in a different direction. And that quest for glory is turned up into just hiding in shame. And I think a lot of us say, well, we're not supposed to get glory. We're not supposed to be wanting that sort of thing, right? Well, I was reminded of John chapter 12, verse 42. There were many of the authorities that believed in Jesus, but because they feared the Pharisees, they didn't confess that they believed in Jesus, that their allegiance and loyalty was going to Jesus. They didn't do it because they were afraid and they didn't want to be put out of the synagogue. They were living in a structure that kept them wrapped up pretty tight too. And it says, for they loved the glory that comes from man. Okay, so that's obviously put here, the glory that comes from man, that's right out. But it says, they love the glory that comes from man more than the glory that comes from God. Because there is glory that comes from God. He sees you. He takes you seriously. He understands you. He knows you. He loves you. And in this family at ICC, we do too. You know, our shame keeps us hiding, but Jesus is calling you out. Our faults keep us paralyzed, but Jesus frees us with his forgiveness. Our past is full of regrets, but Jesus leads us to glory. So what you've done and what's been done to you leaves you paralyzed sometimes, hidden with fear and regret. I get it. I'm like that too. I close my eyes and think about things I said, things I did, and I just shake my head like, oh man, what a mess. And so what you've done and what's been done to you can leave you paralyzed, can keep you wanting to stay hidden out of fear, not humility, but fear and regret. But God doesn't operate like that. He can use the broken. He can reclaim the used, the discarded. And in Jesus, we find our glory. So shame hits us all. And when you don't know where to hide, I've got an advice for you. Hide in Jesus. As the scriptures say, be found in him. For in him is our glory. In him is our freedom. In him is our forgiveness. God is up to something. And yes, even in your life, he knows what you're going through and is calling you out to him. Would you come to Jesus?